very packed with very rich content with very little breaks in between. This session is scheduled to have 5 presentations. I'm sure there will be 4. For certain, we have 3 in the room with us now. One more person will be coming. The 5th person I haven't seen at the conference, Krishna Mazumdar from India, which is unfortunate because her perspective is always very, very interesting. This is all about index construction, model building. We're not going to be presenting data, but we're going to be presenting the process of whereby one goes about constructing those instruments. And the first presentation will be with Brian, building a new quality of life index, and we'll be trying to do that. And then myself and Joe Sirgy will be presenting our work on advances in well-being based on a book that we just completed, which will be out in another month or so. And we'll talk about that. And then Kai is Eugene
wanted to
also
join, I will present.
You'll present, okay. Measuring community well-being, and I always know there's a splashy show associated with Kai's presentation. And the last one will be what constitutes well-being, and that will be Willem, Deijl, who's not here. So let's begin with Ryan. Ryan, you have 10 minutes. Sure. And my awful job is to be time master.
You're the guy that throws the marker when we arrive at
And you have to
Okay.
and talk.
Okay, all right. So I'm tethered,
Tethered.
which will be
Go for it.
which will be an interesting experience because I do not normally tether very well. So
Of course, if you speak loudly, you won't have to use the
this
podium.
mic, yeah, I probably will not use the podium mic. So it's always interesting when you get put on a methodology panel as the person who doesn't have a lot of experience actually in the field that he's come to talk about. Primarily, I'm a public policy person. I'm mostly interested in how do we consider what public policy looks like, what does the evaluation do, and so I come to quality of life or well-being from a particular perspective, a perspective of how do we start to answer some of the questions. And what I'm going to present today is the result of a public policy conundrum that developed in the rural western United States, where there was a debate that emerged about how do you actually measure what's going on primarily with public lands issues to be able to actually engage in some evaluation that goes beyond simple measures of income. Because both sides of the debate managed to agree that the simple measure of income was inadequate, and they both keyed in on life quality as a potential way to get around it, but both sides were doing it relatively badly. They were simply making assertions in the public policy literature about what was going on, and at their root, fundamentally, one was claiming immeasurables essentially, and the other side was simply using proxies for income. They were simply using income to say its quality of life. So partly this work emerges out of a United States Department of Agriculture grant that ran for a number of years that we've been updating for a while now. But this is where we start. So this actually comes out from one side of the debate that emerged. This is from a group called the Sonoran Institute. They're an advocacy think tank based out of the southwestern United States who, beginning in the mid-2000s, started to do work focused on what's the impact of protected or federally owned lands on rural communities and economies. And as part of that, they issued this report, which was has a great name. It made a lot of splash. You've come a long way, cowboy. And as one of their sort of keys, they keyed on something that I think is actually true, although not terribly useful the way they start to describe it. And that is, the standard of living is not the same as quality of life. They're making a key point, because one of the points that they make through all of this study is that if all you do is take an income measure and call that success or failure of the public policy or the impact of federal lands, then you're missing something essential. And they suggest that what you should measure instead is quality of life, is how they start to talk about it, or at some points they actually go back and forth between well-being and quality of life, which unless you get well into this literature, you don't realize the difference. As a neophyte, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that difference was exactly. But they start to mix these things up. And so one of the things that we started to think through was, well, okay, if both sides are claiming this, how could you actually begin to measure at a county level something that looks like quality of life? What would that look like? And so we took seriously the claims of both of the two sides. So to give you a sense, U.S. counties are the primary unit of analysis we were interested in. That tends to be where most of this work is done, dealing with federal lands. And we're primarily interested in it at the end of all of this as an explanatory variable because of its links to other things. It's where we end up, as opposed to it being the right metric for evaluating the public policy. What we find through this whole process is it may actually, instead of being the result of public policy, we find strong evidence, including some work I presented this morning, that it's impacting what's going on with public policy instead of it simply being the outcome. So here's a sense of the United States. Each of the little blocks drawn in there are counties. You get a strong sense of the division in the U.S. So if you move very far east of what the dividing line is the Mississippi River, and you move west, the geographic size of the counties go way, way up. Incidentally, the population density also, on average, goes down. And so we're interested in this level of analysis. In large part, we're trying to explain what's going on in rural communities, although we expand that to include all 3,000 counties by the time this project is over. And this also happens to be the most granular level where the data is reasonably available in any sort of sense that you can actually use and get a timely update. So we then sojourn into this part of the literature, again as neophyte, subjective versus subjective measures. I spent the better part of my doctoral career trying to figure out this distinction. I still don't know the right answer, other than it's pretty clear what we're doing comes down pretty firmly on the objective side. Although I'm not certain, based on some experimental work we've done, that we really have anything other than a distinction without a difference. That if you're constructing objective measures reasonably well, you should be able to get consistent experimental results that people are at least thinking about. But again, this is all inside the U.S. context, pretty dramatically. So, sort of fast forward to where we get. So we end up with 5 indicator sections, what we call infrastructure, public safety, health, economic development, and education. I mean, these are nothing new. They're pretty consistent, pretty standard out of the literature. They sum up rather nicely. And we then say, so why an index? Well, you may also ask, why another index? There are a fair number of these out there. But there's not a lot that try to address the public, try to be usable for public policy, or that are focused on U.S. county level data like this is, where it's actually granular enough to ask some of these questions. So we're interested in the same things that any index will do: reliability, comparability, severability. So if you really think we're wrong about infrastructure, the way we build the index, you can pull infrastructure out and tell us we're wrong. Pull it out. We don't use weights in the data that we present, although you certainly can assign weights to them. We didn't have a good reason ex ante to know what those weights should be. And then we're interested in repeatability, all those sorts of things. And we use a very simple formula. It's not a new formula. It's been used by the UN. It's used by another project called the Economic Freedom of the World that we work pretty closely with on other projects. And it's just a scaling of the data. To take the data so it can be scaled together. Again, we use averages. We don't weight to create the end result. So now I can walk you through more detail the mechanism by which we go through. It's rather lengthy arithmetic.
Fine, just
Yeah.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right, we're actually on track by somewhere. But what I'm more interested in, and I think which is the more interesting question, is less about how do you scale the data. That's a very simple process. And more that what we looked at when we were trying to measure public policy and actually be able to talk through this is there were 3 parts that we were interested in each of these indicators. The first was we use funding effort, which is an intensity measure, to say, okay, so what is the county, what are county governments and private industry spending in each of these areas? It's a proxy for production, pure and simple. We're interested in the outcome. This one's pretty straightforward. What are the actual measurable outcomes that are happening? And then, is the service actually available across the counties? Now, you may think in the U.S., you would have relatively high penetration across these things, but it turns out there's a variety, especially when you move into the more rural parts of the country where service availability is low. This ends up having the least variability, the least variation of any of them, but there's still a fair amount there. So again, gives you a sense of what those things look like. And then to do that, we did a couple of different things to try to validate the index that we're in fact measuring something. We start with confirmatory factor analysis, and we get relatively good loading, consistent on factor 1. Seems to be something consistent there. But again, there are problems with factor analysis. You can be chasing an illusion. So we also do a principal components analysis to see coming out of the other direction. And again, we find relative consistency there. And then finally, we took these same things and adapted them to an experimental setting with about 1,500 undergraduates. Again, it's a convenience sample, so nothing, it's not fully randomized, it's not representative, but we get relatively strong results from the ordered logit as well that suggests that at least when students are reporting that they're working through these things, so we use a distraction exercise and then introduce, that these things seem to be mattering how they think about their own life quality. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or however you want to go through.
Let's take questions for students. I'm sorry about the press, but it's just the reality of.
Fortunately, I knew there were 5 papers, so the presentation was built to go through. And it also means that I can punt on any of the crazy stuff in the calculation.
We have time for a couple of questions or comments.
Sir, no? Yeah.
Okay, since you didn't finish the presentation, I'm very much interested in the conclusion.
Yeah.
So what's the conclusion?
So the conclusion is that as you work through all this, that on the first part is constructions of claims of public policy using quality of life as an outcome in public policy discussions. No one's actually using something that's measured. They're chasing illusions. But on the other hand, when you start to consider what is determined in a variety of things, so things like voter turnout, things like decision-making in direct democracy elections. So now we start to move into my actual wheelhouse, this sort of political behavior, that we've often just dumped income into those to say, it's going to tell us something about it. And often it almost always comes back significant and important. But when you include life quality measures, you see a strong relationship between them. And so I think the sum up of it all is that what we thought was supposed to be an outcome measure, a way to really sort of do better public policy analysis, morphed into something that has explanatory power on the other side of the equation. So that's the grand sum up of it all. That having been said, it's not a very sophisticated quality of life index. It's a relatively rough cut. And yet it's consistent. So we've now updated this once with another round of data. So we started with 2 panels. And we've now been able to add 3 more, and we see similar direction, similar strength across.
But the data that you're getting is essentially census data.
It's census data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data. It's all at the aggregate county level. We can't say much of anything about individual life quality determinations. We can only talk
I
aggregates.
think it would be useful for people to know how many of those geopolitical counties actually exist.
Yeah,
There was a lot of blocks.
Yeah, there's 3,100-ish.
3,100
They
separate
come.
geopolitical units that do.
And there's this assumption that these things are relatively static in the U.S. You actually see they move in and out of being a county determination with some regularity. It creates a totally separate, interesting problem when counties merge and then unmerge over the period of 30 or 40 years.
Would you follow up? Why the county level and not, as I said, I mean, that was a whole bunch of cities and.
Yeah, so why county level?
Right.
So the short answer is that's where the fight in the literature we were looking at was based. Everybody was using county level data to try to understand the effect of federal lands. But it's we've had some success using MSAs because the same data is available. That it's you get a different set of data when you move to municipalities, but again, it would probably be relatively easy to adapt. But that was where the policy fight was occurring at the get-go.
Policy in relation to land use.
Federal land ownership.
Okay.
It's
So it's kind of restricted.
It was very restricted from that point of view. But what I think makes it interesting for quality of life, this area, is that it's an approach to trying to deal with public policy that doesn't necessarily say you have to start with somebody else's index, but there's a way to try to structure the data to attempt to answer the questions. Now, we didn't end up there. We ended up with a totally different outcome, but it was a way to start to think through how public policy can be related to quality of life, which has public policy scholars don't tend to do that. We tend to run in fear of that notion.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you. Have this on to- you're up next.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I have no idea how to get to this.
Just close the doors.
Joe and I, Sirgy and I are making this presentation. We have a total of 10 minutes between us, so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, and then Joe's going to talk for a few minutes, then we'll take questions and answers. Essentially, he and I have just completed a 3-year project on the history of well-being. This is a history which traces the concept of quality of life and well-being over a full 4,000-year historical period, with most of the time spent on the regional analyses since the Second World War. But the first part of the book deals with conceptions of well-being in Islamic societies, in Confucian, Buddhist societies, and so on, to try and provide a framework for it. One of our struggles, as you can imagine, in carrying out a project of this type, was to determine an appropriate conceptual framework that would inform both that 3-year study and a second book that we're now completing called Advances in Wellbeing, which will be released probably around February. If we stay on schedule. But they're both very related. The second book is sort of a cliff note summary of what's in the larger book, so they're very much related. Our issue was around the conceptualization models. We identified 60 different approaches to assessing quality of life and well-being from the period of the Second World War forward. And as you would imagine, most of the early models were economic models, which is exactly what many of us have been struggling against for the last number of years. That is to not define quality of life or the sense of well-being using strictly economic metrics, recognizing that life is much richer than how much money you have in your pocket and so on. So we've identified those, and we selected 2 models that would inform the corpus of the body of work that we did in both the pursuit of well-being, the untold global history, and the advances in well-being. The first one was the weighted index of social progress, which is mostly associated with my work, with just the index of social progress. The second one is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Health Wellbeing Index. Joe's going to talk about that. I will just basically describe what the index of social progress consists of. It's 41 indicators divided across 10 sub-indexes. And these are sectors, sub-indexes, sectors of communal life that we've demonstrated over a period of many, many years to be the most important ones in terms of assessing quality of life and well-being. And I'm not going to get into the indicators that are used to operationalize it because we don't have time for that. But they represent the 10 sectors. This is the weighting system that's used. As you see, it was a combination of factor analysis and other methods used to come up with the item weights, the sub-index weights, and then the overall index weights put together in a very creative way. The methodology uses 160 countries, 162 it says there, and we have time series data beginning in 1970 for every 5-year period. So, and it's original data collected at the time from multiple sources. So we're now into almost 50 years of original data collection. It's a major source of information. Issues of missing data have been dealt with, and we can talk about that, and the time periods are also reflected there. The data sources are primarily United Nations. I should say they're country sources. Data provided by countries to international, non-governmental, or international governmental bodies that collect data in a coherent fashion. So the UN, the UNDP, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all require member states to collect the same, to report the same kind of data using exactly the same set of definitions. What's been very interesting about the journey is that the breadth and richness of data has increased tremendously since 1970. More and more indicators have come online, and of course we've been able to go into the archives and get data. And sometimes for whole regions of the world, for example, the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, we were finally able to get information on the separate member states, member republics of the former Soviet Union. And many independent scholars and non-governmental organizations. These are the 4 levels of analysis that the data are reported for. And this is what the data look like over that period of time, showing the decennial period and then region and the changes that have taken place. For me, one of the most important slides is this one, which reports progress in Africa for the first time, beginning in 2010. This is a dramatic shift that's taken place. I mean, Africa was in the doldrums, as you can see, fairly steady state for the better part of 40 years, but it's definitely launched and taken off in a very progressive direction at this point. And this is what it looks like at the global level using a single graph. And we have these graphs for each time period, so you can see the way in which the redness is dispersed, and the pink, the shades are dispersed around the world. So that's one method. I'm going to back up. Joe, this is yours now. The OECD. And if you want to just go into your slides that you created, that's fine.
Yeah.
Maybe just, if we do just one. So,
We've got a whole bunch of indicators out there, and some of the popular indicators, Richard's social progress indicator is one heck of an indicator, set that has quite a bit of data. It's very rich. It's very well established. Same thing with the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is also very rich, and it has continuity in the sense that we need to plot trends and the like. The problem with some of the very well-established indicators, like, for example, the Social Progress Index or the Human Development Index, and of course the OECD has its own index, is that they don't make distinctions between what some scholars talk about as outcome indicators versus action indicators. Action indicators are the kinds of indicators that ultimately guide public policy. Again, let me repeat that. Action indicators, which is different from outcome indicators. Outcome indicators are essentially, let me give you an example. This is the OECD framework of indicators related to health well-being. And let me make this distinction between outcome indicators and action indicators using their framework. And I think it's a beautiful framework because it has the potential of coming up with all kinds of other types of indicators and making those distinctions that would allow public policy people to connect the dots. Now, what are the dots? Outcome indicators is this: health status, life expectancy at birth, life expectancy by sex and education, mortality from cancer, mortality from cardiovascular disease, mortality from transport accident, suicide, infant mortality, and so forth, right? These are outcome indicators. In order to affect outcome indicators, you need action indicators, the kinds of things that impact those outcomes, right? And therefore, action indicators based on much of the work that is done in health